Every constitution is a ray of hope. H for harmony, O for opportunity, P for people, and E for equality. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. A topic of discussion today: Sri Lanka's uprising forces out a president, but has it left a system in crisis? Joining us this evening on the show are Attorney at Law Bhavani Fonseca, Senior Researcher, Center for Policy Alternatives, President's Counsel Razik Zarruq, Attorney at Law, Dr. Gehan Gunatilaka. Thank you very much, gentlemen and the lady, for joining us this evening on the show. Let's get the ball rolling with Mr. Razik Zarruq, President's Counsel. Mr. Zarruq, I want to ask you a lot of questions about the Constitution, what the acting president is doing right now, but I need to ask you a question about your thoughts on President Gotabaya Rajapaksa fleeing out of the country a few days after the 9th of July this year. What are your thoughts? Because you
fleeing the country,
because you are one individual who was promoting the ideologies of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. You are one individual who was promoting his vision for the future as well, and you've been on the show many a times and you promoted his ideologies. However, when you heard that the person who you supported at the last presidential campaign had to flee out of the country on the 9th of July this year because of a protest,
well,
what was going through your mind?
I thought, I too will have the same, the reasons to question my own conscience as much as you question me now. But I think that he is guided at that time not by his own decision. He is guided by his security advisors and his security. If the security says that they have intelligence reports with them, and if the intelligence reports indicate to the people who are in charge of his security that he should leave the country, then he should. Because he cannot override the security, because any president, probably even the President of the United States of America, are subjected completely and are guided by the security. So it's a decision not made purely by him, though he would have. But I must say that I am told and that he was there till the very last moment. And he's one man who told, I'm not, when he was going, he said, look, I will wait a little more. He said, no, sir, they are at the gates.
No, Ms. Zarruq,
so that is it. So that's a decision he made on advice of the security.
Yeah, Ms. Zarruq, my question was very simple to you. It was about what you felt after President Gotabaya Rajapaksa fled the country following the protests that took place on the 9th of July this year. What was going through your mind?
The vacuum in leadership. What is going to happen? Where will there be law and order, or will there be anarchy? That is what went through my mind immediately.
But with regard to what transpired after President Gotabaya Rajapaksa became president, didn't you regret the decision that you took? We are in this mess right now. Isn't it because of him?
I don't regret the decision which I took somewhere in 2019 when I supported him. Quite rightly, as you said, I have no regrets at all. But at that time I was guided by his manifesto. And I thought, having taken his record of performance here and what he has done, not necessarily as Secretary of Defense, but also what he did to the city of Colombo and the other cities when he was in charge of the UDA, I thought that it's a good thing that a man who can do some job of work takes over. I mean, I had a lot of faith in what he's about to do or what he would do, as much as the other 6.9 million people who voted for him. I must tell you that. I'm one of the 6.9. There's no question about it. I'm not ashamed to admit that. So I had hopes, like if all the entire 6.9 million, 2/3 of this of Parliament had the same hope. But somewhere, something went wrong. And that is what we had to look into. And it didn't happen. And I think there was a comedy of errors, a series of it. And that contributed to this, to be very honest about it.
But every single time, Mr. Zarruq, President Rajapaksa was making mistakes after mistakes. You were one of the staunch supporters of him, and you were very close to the Minister of Justice as well at one point.
I think Keep on reporting that I am a supporter. Of course, I was a supporter. There's no question about it. I mean, I have no regrets on it.
Yeah.
But as much as the 6.9 million people who voted for him had hopes, and I too had hopes. At the same, and I had not only hopes, and I thought he's a doer. But of course, there was. I think the main problem, Shamir, is the disharmony between. Let's think macro. I mean, rather than going to narrow things.
Yeah.
The disharmony between fiscal policy and monetary policy. That is the one that created the issue at the beginning itself. And that led to it, and compounded by the COVID-19. So there were certain policy decisions that were made which was completely wrong and should not have been taken. And of course, COVID compounded it. That erased our earnings. And these things added on one to the other, and then from that point onwards, a lot of errors committed. Added on to the fertilizer issue, which brought the farmers out, and leading one to the other, from one to the other.
Look at where the country is now, Mr. Zaruk. We're talking about a way forward for Sri Lanka. We're talking about trying to come out of this abyss. Why? Because 6.9 million people thought, like you, that beautification of roads, modification of roads, making sure that the Colombo city limits are good and well, and because his leadership of the 2009 war, which ended, that he is the right person to lead the country. However, you don't have to answer that question. I now move on to the questions relating to the constitution and so on and so forth. 225 members now in parliament. You mentioned before that the government got an overwhelming majority at the 2020 general election, which led to the government being able to have a formidable number of 2/3 in parliament. Don't you think that the people rejected the 2/3 in parliament because of the protests that we saw, and the Aragalaya and the protest march that we saw continuously over the last few months? Don't you think the people have rejected this 2/3 in parliament?
This is all wrong to equate both. 2/3 in parliament is by exercising the right of vote. Maybe they may not get 2/3 or they may not get any, that's a different issue. But don't equate what happens, the opposition that took place because of the situation in the country, the economic situation more than anything else. You don't equate that to the parliamentary, the membership of the parliament. Now, this is exactly what should be avoided, because the supremacy of parliament. After all, 225 people have been elected by the people, and those people who have 225 who have reflects the genius of the people who have elected them. The genius of the people who have elected them. So now you can't find two other things. You can't say simply because a group of people, a fair number of people, quite a lot of people who come onto the streets and then start shouting slogans are saying this. That doesn't mean that you could subjugate parliament unless, of course, you go for a referendum or you go for a general election.
So that is what...
Simply because people shout on the road doesn't mean that parliament should be abandoned or dissolved. Well, I suggest that the ideal thing would be to go for a general election. I'm suggesting that. But give some time. This is not the time to go for a general election, because give some time. It may be 3 years, or it may be, sorry, not 3 years, certainly not 3 months or 6 months. But we have to stabilize. You'll have to make available the essentials like gas, fuel, and the medicines in hospitals, and stabilize the prices, and then and finalize the discussions with the IMF, and have some money, because I understand a general election will cost anything between 6 billion to 10 billion rupees. So I think I think most probably, if everything goes well, the ideal time would be 6 months a time period to go for a general election. That would be the best thing if there is so much of opposition in the country. And as you quite rightly said, the only way is to not to chase the 225 from parliament. Parliament is supreme, and that's the worst thing that one could do. And that would amount to not a struggle but a revolution. So we don't want to go in for a revolution. So the only thing is, if that is so, the only way to eliminate that is to go for a general election as soon as possible. And that is possible only and only if we stabilize the situation in the country, that is the economic situation, and thereafter decide on a general election. I don't say that wait for 2.5 years, certainly not, as things are. I would say 6 months time frame, and within this 6 months time frame, we can stabilize the economy, have enough money to go for election, say anything between 6 billion to 10 billion. It should be something in between. Billion to 10 billion. And then go for elections. That is the way to change, to have a change of government. Not for the government to resign or go home simply because people shout on the streets. No way.
Right. Mr. Zaruk, what are your thoughts with regard to the behavior of the acting president of the country? Few days, took over power, addressed the nation 3 times, made an announcement saying that he's going to not call the post of president His Excellency, and got rid of the official flag of the president as well. He's moving some pawns, isn't he?
I mean, each one has his own agenda, no? Each president. It can be vistas of vision, or it can be Yahapalane, or it can be anything, you may call it by any name. So each one has a vision and he likes to come out with it and tell the people. So he said, look, and in this period, this is what I intend to do. I mean, he's quite entitled to do that. And these are not long-winded addresses that he made. He just shared his thoughts with the people. And often as he did, and of course...
But he's the acting president, he is not president yet.
That's right, so why not acting president? And there's no difference between an acting president and a president as long as you act.
What happened to the post of Prime Minister now? Acting Prime Minister? Because we saw with the demise of Ranasinghe Premadasa in the early 1990s, we saw how D.B. Wijayatunga appointed the leader of the House who had the cabinet portfolio as the acting Prime Minister. But now, we are not seeing that situation anymore.
You are right. You're right. I think Article 43, subsection 3 is very clear on that. You know, where he could appoint an acting, he shall, the word I was told is he shall appoint an acting Prime Minister. And for this period, but this just being only for a few days. We'll be having another 72 hours, we'll have a new president. So what's the purpose in appointing an acting Prime Minister for 72 hours? You know, so that perhaps that must be the rationale. I don't know what went in the mind of Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe, but perhaps this may be the rationale. I feel that it may be just 72 hours. Why just burden with another office?
Right. Only if the Constitution could be articulated
right.
on
says
that
the Constitution
matter.
says she shall.
But again, if we try to talk about the manifestos that we've seen in the past in Sri Lanka, the 2019 manifesto with regard to the vistas of prosperity and splendor. Right now, Mr. Zaruk, we are facing splendor and prosperity and all that and more right now in Sri Lanka. So let's leave it at that. So now I move my attention to Attorney at Law Bhavani Fonseca, Senior Researcher of Center for Policy Alternatives. Bhavani, interestingly, today we saw the acting president taking a very bold step to declare the state of emergency in the country. Do you think this was an apt move by the acting president?
No, Shamir. I mean, we've been very clear. We don't need a state of emergency at this moment. There are uncertainties. There's unrest in Sri Lanka, but there's also other laws that can come in. Now, last week we saw curfew being imposed under the PSO, which didn't require a state of emergency. So the question now is, why do you declare a state of emergency at this moment? And it also sends a message that this is becoming kind of the default position. If you think about it, this year in 2022, the government, the former president, declared twice, in April as well as in May, and now we have the third state of emergency. And all of these moments raises the question that the executive arm is normalizing these situations and making emergency the default position when there are sufficient laws to bring the law and order situation under control. This is also, I think we need to keep in mind, Sri Lanka has had years of emergency being used, and through emergency we've also seen repression, violations. And what's the message that sends at this moment when the international community is also looking to Sri Lanka, looking to stability, looking to ensure there is some scope to support? Bringing a state of emergency sends a very wrong message to both Sri Lankans as well as outside.
Bhavani, interestingly now, we're talking about 4 names to take over the post of presidency in Sri Lanka, which is going to take place, hopefully, on the 20th of this month. Can the acting president, on the guise of state of emergency, prorogue parliament?
Anything is possible. That's something we need to be very mindful, that anything is possible in Sri Lanka. And in the past we've seen various justifications. So one thing I want to be very clear, the office of the executive president is so broad, so powerful, that we need to look to abolishing that. So the past that comes with the office has been used in the last decades, not just in the last 2.5 years under Gotabaya Rajapaksa, but in the last few decades, to really push arbitrary practices, to normalize certain practices. So it's extremely worrying what could happen in the next 2 to 3 days.
But can the acting president do that?
The acting president could do anything, really. That's the problem, and who is going to check that? Now, one can run to the Supreme Court and challenge certain actions, but that's not going to get an immediate response. So this is the problem. So I want to just bring this in terms of reforms, and you raised this question about the protesters and the demands of the protesters. The demand has been very clear for a system change, for a new culture, for political accountability. Now, if you're looking to bringing these things, this executive office also needs to be re-looked at. These powers that come with the office need to be revisited. So a lot of these things can be practiced in the guise of an emergency, in the guise of public security. So we have to be very, very careful in the next few days, extremely mindful. State of emergency could bring in other issues as well. So it's really a couple of days of, I would say, uncertainty.
Because when you saw the statement today made by acting President Ranil Wickremesinghe with regard to threats being launched against parliamentarians, and it's important to ensure their security. Again, with the state of emergency being declared, it seems to an outsider who's looking at all this in an eagle's eye view that if the acting president is not able to garner the support that he should get at the election, which is supposed to happen on the 20th, he might go and prorogue parliament. And if you prorogue parliament, that means the parliament will not convene for close to a month or so until it has to be tabled in parliament once again, and then he has to reconvene. And within a month, a lot can happen in Sri Lanka. Do you think there's a possibility, this conspiracy theory, does that make any sense to you, Bhavani?
Nothing is making sense at the moment, Shamir. I mean, the whole issue of declaring a state of emergency doesn't make sense. But it comes with the executive office, unfortunately, and it comes back to the whole point of what are the checks and balances on this office. I also want to make this point. Under the premiership, under Ranil Wickremesinghe's premiership, they did introduce a 22nd Amendment, the bill. Now, even that bill continues to keep certain powers of the executive presidency. So the question then to ask is, really, does Ranil Wickremesinghe and those around him, do they really want to bring genuine reforms, or do you want to continue to keep this very problematic office in place? You're quite right in terms of this uncertainty. Anything could happen tomorrow, anything could happen on Wednesday. So we are going into a time period where we wake up and we may not know what the situation is in the country. But I really do hope the political leadership, including the Prime Minister and the Speaker and the 225 members realize the gravity of the situation and hold that election on Wednesday.
Do you think, Bhavani, right now the need of the hour is an election, as Mr. Zarur pointed out before?
In terms of a general election?
General election?
I think we have to go in for a general election in a few months' time, because there is, I would say, the 225 members of parliament, while they are members of parliament, I feel they have lost the mandate. There has to be a new election where there is a mandate of the people, considering the crisis, considering what Sri Lanka has gone through and is likely to go through. But this is also at a time where we are facing an unprecedented economic crisis. We don't have money. We have long queues. So the issue is, when can you hold an election and not lead to further instability? So that's something to look at. But I think in a few months or early next year, one can hold elections.
Right. Thank you very much, Attorney at Law Bhavani Fonseca, Senior Researcher of the Centre for Policy Alternatives. I now move my attention to Attorney at Law, Dr. Gihan Gulatilaka. Nice to have you, Gihan, on the show after a very long time. I heard that you arrived in Sri Lanka this morning, and thank you very much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
In a span of a few hours. I really appreciate it, and thank you very much for coming on the show tonight. So, Gihan, interestingly, we're talking about an election that is supposed to be held on the 20th to elect the president of Sri Lanka, the 8th executive president of Sri Lanka. Do you think right now what is happening based on the constitution of the country?
Yes, it is. I mean, largely speaking, there are certain steps that need to follow once a president resigns from office. The first step is, of course, the Prime Minister to become the acting president. That step has taken place. Then, of course, you have to have Parliament meeting within 3 days. That has also happened. And then the next step is for nominations to be called, a particular deadline to be fixed. That's also happened. And then the fourth step is for Parliament to convene a second time and for nominations to be announced. And then we find out how many candidates are actually going to contest. And if there's more than one candidate, and it's likely that we will have more than one candidate, we'll move to the fifth step, which is an election. And that's what's going to happen, hopefully, on the 20th. This is all happening according to the Constitution as far as I can see. The only thing that I see as a very clear violation of the Constitution is the fact that the acting president has not acted under Article 41C of the Constitution, where he is required by the Constitution to appoint an acting Prime Minister. And this is a mandatory constitutional duty. And this hasn't happened, and I think that is a violation. So if you ask the question, has everything happened according to the Constitution, I would say this is clearly outside the purview of the Constitution. And then, of course, the emergency declaration, I would say, is blatantly unconstitutional. I don't see any real reason, and I agree with Bhavan, any real reason to declare state of emergency other than, if you really want to make sense of it, other than a platform to campaign. Because, of course, when there's a narrative that parliamentarians are being pressurized on social media, you make a declaration of a state of emergency to say we are going to protect parliamentarians by monitoring social media. Of course, there are no emergency regulations that have been issued just yet, so we don't even know under what powers or regulations this monitoring is taking place. But I think what is really happening is that the acting president is using this as an opportunity to campaign. He's using his acting presidency as an opportunity to campaign, and emergency is part of that campaign.
Right. So, interestingly, Gihan, as I said before, the acting president has addressed the nation 3 times now after taking over office as the acting president. And he seems to be maneuvering and doing a campaign, as you said before, for the people to realize that he is the person that could steer the country to the next level. And that itself, isn't that a violation? Because we have 4 individuals who are vying for the top post of the country, that is Ranil Wickremesinghe, Dalla Salah Peruma, Sajid Premadasa and Anand Kumar Disanayak, who have already told that they would be vying for the top job of Sri Lanka in a few days from now. Don't you think that the acting president is being a little bit way too optimistic about this particular position in question, and he seems to be thinking or of the idea that he will be the next president of the country.
You're quite right in the sense that he is behaving like the incumbent president, not the acting president. And he's using that position to campaign for the actual election that takes place on the 20th. I don't think there is a constitutional violation as such, because once you are acting president, you do have the powers that flow from that office. Any act that you actually go ahead with can be challenged in Supreme Court, as Bhavani mentioned. So that would be up for debate as to whether actually using this position or manipulating this position to campaign is a violation of the Constitution. So I would say it is certainly a bad faith use of that office. And if you're talking about good faith and bad faith, it's certainly bad faith. But I wouldn't go so far as to declare it illegal. It is definitely a case of the acting president behaving like the incumbent president.
But if you look at the last few hours, the last 24 hours, Gihan, petrol prices were reduced by 20 rupees. He's creating an environment for people to believe that there is a proper token system in place, there is fuel distribution that will happen very systematically in the country. All this, what are the signals that it's giving out to the people?
I mean, it's a campaign. Basically, the signal is that if I'm in charge, I will be able to deliver. And after all, we are in a campaign. We are in an election campaign. Of course, what is unfortunate is that the people who will actually vote are not people who will be incentivized by the public interest. It's people who will be incentivized by their own interest. Because right now we have a parliament who is completely discredited. And I agree with Mrs. Aruk that we shouldn't be looking to, get rid of parliament without a process of election, without declaring an election and actually following that process. But there's no doubt that parliament has lost its mandate, at least the majority of parliament. So what we have, unfortunately, is a bunch of people who will be voting alongside their own interests as opposed to the public interest. That's not what happens in an election. People vote for their interests. And now we are spectators in a parliamentary election of the president. We are mere spectators. And that, I think, is really unfortunate, which is why it's very important that we ultimately normalize the situation in terms of what is happening on the streets.
So we're getting a lot of questions via SMS 0766565353. I'll try to take these questions as much as possible as the show goes on. I promise you, so keep on sending those questions and we'll try to accommodate it. But very quickly, Dr. Gihan, before I open the floor for questions from Charlene, who's going to take oaths in a few days from now, or a few months from now, and also Jayamal, who's working in the corporate sector and also a producer for News First. Gihan, now we have 4 people, and you've been at Oxford, you've done your masters there, you are involved with a lot of global political scenarios and so on and so forth. So in your opinion, what are the qualities that a president or the 8th executive president should have in the country at this very moment of time?
I mean, that's an interesting question, and I don't think I'll have a good answer to this. But I do know what qualities they should not have. And certainly there was a sense in this last few months that the leaders were totally out of touch with what was happening on the streets. I mean, really, did the Prime Minister on the 9th of May have to leave office in such indignity? Did the President have to leave office in such a, sensational manner? It seemed that the President and Prime Minister, his brother, they both were out of touch with what was going on the streets, and I think that is a very unfortunate thing. So there is a sense, I think, that once you come to a leadership position, you are all powerful. You become a ruler as opposed to a servant. Ultimately, the president has to be the top public servant, not a ruler. And that change of attitude and that change of mindset is absolutely key in terms of the next leader. I think the executive presidency has to be abolished, and we have to move to a completely different model. And the leader who leads that model has to be someone who really understands that he or she is ultimately working for the people and not the other way around.
So when Mr. Zarruq said that he has a few hours, like 7 hours, and he should not appoint a prime minister, he shouldn't waste his time appointing an acting prime minister.
I didn't say that.
You said
I
72
said
hours.
Perhaps that, because there's only 72 hours that.
So why should he appoint
may
an
have
acting,
decided not to appoint
an acting prime
yeah,
minister?
not that he should not appoint. I didn't say that.
Yeah, but
Two different things.
right,
You like
but constitutionally, you should appoint an acting
Oh, absolutely.
prime minister.
The constitution is supreme, and the prime minister has a constitutional duty to appoint an acting prime minister.
So hypothetically, let's say on the 20th of this month, Ranil Wickremesinghe loses the election to secure the top job. He automatically becomes the prime minister of the country.
He has never left the office of prime minister as far as the constitution is concerned. He is a stopgap solution when he becomes acting president. It's a stopgap solution. And then you go back to being prime minister the moment a permanent appointment is made by parliament. Of course, that appointment as prime minister can also change if the new president decides to remove you. Because if someone else commands the confidence of parliament, it's likely that he will be removed. But as far as the constitution is concerned, it is Ranil Wickremesinghe who is the prime minister. He then ceases to function as prime minister because he shall act as president, and then he shall act to also appoint someone else in the cabinet as acting prime minister.
So in the event there is an acting prime minister, if the acting president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, loses the elections on the 20th, what happens to him?
He goes back to his cabinet portfolio. That's what happens.
Simple as that.
Simple
and
as
the
that.
acting prime minister will automatically cease to function as the prime minister of the country.
That's right, and he'll go back to his ministerial position. And if the prime minister at that stage is removed, cabinet is dissolved, and then you have to restart. Yeah.
50 years in politics. Look at what the acting president of the country is taking us all through. Anyway, I open the floor for questions from our journalists. On to my immediate right is Charlotte Benedict. On to my immediate left is Jama Ratnak, as I mentioned before. Let's start off with Jama for a change.
Definitely.
Right, okay, yes, Jama.
Thanks, Sean. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to first direct my attention to Bhavani. Let's talk about how acting President Ranil Wickremesinghe came into Parliament in the first place. He contested through the district list of the United National Party, however did not secure enough votes to come into Parliament, and then was later included in the UNP's national list and brought in. Now, we know the national list is made for those who are not willing to engage in the electoral political process per se, and for intellectuals and professionals who want to come into Parliament without the mandate of the people, but to serve Parliament in a more professional way, if I say so. Is there any provision in the Constitution which says that it is against the Constitution for someone who's included in the district list to be later on included in a national list where he fails to garner enough votes to come into Parliament through the public mandate? And will this lacuna, if there is such a lacuna, will this allow politicians to hijack the place of intellectuals or professionals who are to come into Parliament through the national list for them to simply get into Parliament?
So that's a good question. In terms of looking at the recent practices, how the lists have been used by all political parties. I mean, if you look at the most recent example, was someone who was not even in any list coming into Parliament. And that's a practice, unfortunately, that we are seeing too regularly. And it seems it's happening because of particular interests, vested interests. So not just Ranil Wickremesinghe, and I'll be very clear, Ranil Wickremesinghe was in the district list, Colombo district list. You're seeing others who are not in any list coming in. And that raises a huge question of franchise, because people should know who could come into Parliament, either through the specific district list or know that they're in a national list at some point because that national list remains alive during that particular time. So that anyone in the national list could at some point come into parliament. That is the kind of promise you give to the voter when you campaign. So when you have someone who's not in any list coming, that's hugely problematic. But that is allowed. I mean, we've gone to court and we've challenged this in the Supreme Court, and unfortunately there's not much even the court can do, because there is a lacuna in the law, and it's up to the General Secretary to decide. Now we keep saying there has to be legal reforms, but those legal reforms come through Parliament. So Parliament decides. So the question you ask about Ranil Wickremesinghe coming through the national list, the big question is the legitimacy, because he lost the mandate at the election. He was rejected by the voters. So then do you bring him in? But as it stands at the moment, it's up to the party to decide. We can debate whether it's right or wrong, but it's a party's decision. We can debate whether the party's decision was democratic. That also can be debated. But unfortunately, that's the status quo. So I keep coming back to this point that at this moment, when there's a lot of discussion around what should be the new system, what should be a new culture, new account, like things to look at accountability-wise, not for just elected representatives, but for political parties. This is something we should be looking at, that there are clear restrictions as to who comes in, how they're appointed. It's not abused to serve particular purposes. And this applies to all parties, I would say. All parties have used this, or most parties. I think there are a few who haven't used. Most parties have used this, because I'm just talking about our own experience going to court. We have challenged most of the parties because they brought in just anyone they want to. And it's a complete going back in terms of the right to decide, right to choose. So yes, very problematic, but there's a lot more that needs to be done than just critique a particular member of parliament.
So, Mr. Zaruk, the question with regard to the abolishing of the president's flag and the use of His Excellency by the acting president, don't you think the acting president should have done something better, bring back the former governor of the central bank to the country, Arjuna Mahendran, and show the conviction that he has as the new acting president of the country? Isn't that...
Shall we keep this up at some level rather than being so sarcastic on this matter?
No, it's not being sarcastic. No, this is a question.
I don't think we should do that.
No, Ms. Zaruk,
let's talk something again.
No,
if it's his decision, whether his flag should be there, or the president's flag should be there, or not, or what should be there, or that it should be the prominence should be given to the national flag of Sri Lanka. I mean, to co-equate that and then to have a dig at. I know your entire channel has been attacking this program.
That's true.
Farah Shaukat and all of this.
But
we'll leave that out and we'll discuss the current issues. I don't think if that is so. If that is so, I don't think we are from mundane, we are going down to the profane. I mean, let's not keep up with the status. No, come on, Shami. I think if that is so, let's maintain this at some dignified level. I don't mind taking any of it. But let's not be going to I mean, I don't think he's that foolish as to bring the former governor of the central bank down here. And I think it's very, it doesn't reflect well, because Nandalal Veerasinghe, the current Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe, is doing an excellent job. And he has an excellent rapport, and he's going on, and we have now come to a stage where we are discussing with the IMF. And at this stage, to suggest that this type of thing is really puerile. I don't think I should never reply to that, Sabir. I'm sorry, I'm not going to reply to you. That's very puerile.
No.
I'm sorry about that.
So Ms. Zaruk, in your opinion, how do you think we should move forward now from this point onwards? We are right now in an abyss. We are politically, economically, Sri Lanka is supposed to decide at this very moment of time. A lot of people are saying we should go for a referendum, we should go for a general election, because in 2020, when COVID was at the height of activity, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa decided that we go for an election. So in a situation like that, why not go for an election now? Why not let the people decide? Why not let the people have their final word on who they want to elect
Shami,
as the president or the prime minister of the
I
country.
agree with you, Shamir. It's a question of only timing. The priority now is to eliminate the queues, make the gas available, make the fuel available, make the medicines available, and stabilize the entire system, and then go for an election. If this stabilization takes place not within the next 6 months, but within 6 weeks, for heaven's sake, on a 7th week, go for election. That's a different matter. It's just a matter of time. It's just a whether. I mean, we all agree that we must go for a general election. There's no question about it.
But do you think the people would give their nod for anyone to be elected from the 225
I don't know that.
to
I
the
leave it
next
to the
parliament
people
or
we
next
don't know,
presidency?
minds, I mean, very people, they are very fickle and it can change overnight. After all, it took 30 years for Marcos's son to come back. So it can take 30 days or it can take 30 seconds for people to change their mind. We don't know how the mind of the people work. We don't know. Leave that aside. But the point today is, I mean, be realistic. We have to have a stable economy to go for election. I mean, otherwise we would not be able to do this. I mean, we can't think of an election immediately. First, eliminate these 3 queues, and then let's go for election. Let's go for election. That's the most important thing. Stabilize the whole thing, and then go for
What
election.
happens, Mr. Zaruk, hypothetically?
Yeah.
Let's say a member would be elected on the 20th if there is no proroguing of parliament, and then the Aragale continues once again. People start protesting once again. People start criticizing the government in power. Then what happens?
So the Aragale can continue. Aragale is a democratic process. It has to be encouraged. It has to be continued. But at some point of time, as it had happened a few days ago, the Aragale should not turn into a Viplava. Because these are spontaneous protests that came up and then consolidated itself into a mass movement. But then others are trying to take advantage, the politicization of it. And certain parties trying to take advantage. Those who have no representation in parliament or those who cannot be represented in parliament, trying to get with extra parliamentary manner coming into occupation, or rather trying to take over power. That cannot be allowed. The people's will have to take place. I mean, there's a franchise that has to be exercised by the people, and that should be and that is the process that should be encouraged.
Yeah, so
That's the process that should be encouraged.
Now, 14th of July, Mr. Zaruk,
Yeah.
interesting if you look at history. 1789, the Bastille Day was marked on the 14th of July. The 14th of July is incidentally Rohan Vijayveera's birthday as well, who was championing a cause for his community as well. And the 14th of July in Sri Lanka is also very significant, Mr. Zaruk. Do you know why? Do you know why?
No, I don't. Tell me.
Because that is the day President Gotabaya Rajapaksa fled the country.
Ah.
That is the reason. 14th
What
of
about
July.
the 4th of July? You don't attach any significance to the 4th of July.
How many things that happened in
That's
July
right.
itself?
200 years ago, 4th of July was also significant.
Yeah. So look at the country where we are facing at the moment, Mr.
We are.
Zaruk.
There's no question about
We are
it.
in a
There
situation that people can't decide.
There is general turmoil, and people are very anxious, and they are finding it very difficult. People are in queues for 3-4 days. Schools are closed down. There is no question about it, Shami. There's no question about it. So let's get out of this problem. Let's try to get out of this problem rather than to keep on putting on the blame, go on the blame game. How much of blame can you keep on keeping on a president who is no more here? I mean,
you know
and
until
then,
when?
no,
You-
not
you-
only
you know
that.
until
And
when?
we should also look at it.
You know until when?
Whoever would be appointed or elected as the president on the 20th, whoever it may be, he has a formidable task. Whoever,
Yeah.
he has a formidable task. So, and that is the one that has to be tackled. You know, and I don't agree with Jayan when he said that the acting president is behaving like the, what do you call it? Incumbent president. I mean, acting or otherwise an incumbent president, a president is a president and he has presidential powers. There is nothing to say that an acting president cannot act as the incumbent president. The acting president has every right and every authority to act as the incumbent president. And if he wants to come on TV and say, look, after all, it is not the people who are going to vote. Not the general people of this country who are voting on that day. It's only 225 representatives. So, I mean, he doesn't have to address the nation to address 225 representatives. That he could address them individually, equally, or he might be doing it. Every one of them. All 4 of them must be canvassing all 225 at the moment. There might be calls flying. There might be people, intermediaries going and meeting them. We don't know what sort of canvassing is taking place at the moment. You know, at the moment. And this is...
Maitripala Sirisena said that parliamentarians are being bought also now.
Quite possible. He's quite used to it. He must be doing it better. So, because he has been in Parliament for a long time, so he knows what is exactly happening. I won't rule it out. Yeah. It is quite possible. I don't know who is buying whom. Yeah. That's a different matter. Don't focus it on one party. Yeah. You know, we don't know. So, I mean, leave that as it is. We don't know how this process works, and we know how this process works. Yeah. So, whatever it is, so whoever who comes in, the incumbent president has a very, or the acting president who becomes the incumbent president thereafter, has a very big responsibility. And that responsibility has to be fulfilled. And thereafter only we could think of going on. You cannot say, look, Parliament has to be abolished, Parliament and summon people to come to Parliament from all the other places and say, come over to Parliament and take over Parliament, let's occupy Parliament. And we know what had happened when they occupied the President's house. We know what happened when they occupied the President's Secretariat. We know what happened when they occupied the temple trees. We know what happened when they occupied the Prime Minister's residence. And we also know what happened to the Prime Minister's house. And we are not going to endorse any of those things. We are not going to endorse any of those things. That is not Aragalaya. That is not Aragalaya at all. And that is where you have to draw a line between, at some point, between the Aragalaya and the Viplava. And Aragalaya cannot metamorphose itself, or rather go through a process of metamorphosis and turn into a Viplava. That should be at all costs avoided. And you will avoid, and you will be for that as much as I am.
Yeah. So you usually, Mrs. I don't respond to questions when the panelists ask questions from the journalists. But you asked me a question.
Did I ask you
saying no, you asked me a question as to when will this stop?
No,
when
that's
will
a
all
general
this
question,
stop?
not directed particularly at you, my dear.
No, but still for all.
It's a general question.
You know when it's going to stop? It's going to stop when there is justice.
You are quite right.
When there is justice to the people, you know, when there is the corruption that took place in the country, money was siphoned off from the country, justice. That is when all this would stop, Mr. Zaruk. Anyway,
that's a good answer.
Yeah. Shamir, if I can just, very interesting conversation going on between Shamir and President's Council Zaruk. I'm sorry, President's Council Zaruk, you've been talking for quite a long time, but if I can just pick your brain on this.
I enjoy it. Shamir and I always enjoy it. Don't worry about it.
So
Shamir starts off in a very hostile manner with me every time.
This is all conversation. It's
discourse. It's very important to have dialogue.
President Council Zaruk, what I gathered from the discussion that that you and Shamir had was there are two ways that we can bring stability to the country. You said either the people could sit back and say, okay, we are not going to influence our parliamentarians, we are not going to interfere in any way, because that's apparently what our leaders want, and accept whoever the interim president that Parliament appoints. Or the Parliament now, having on the 9th of May, having a Prime Minister sent out and seeing the carnage that happened after that, then on the 9th of June we had the former Finance Minister leave Parliament itself, and then on the 9th of July we had the President leaving. Seeing all of that, Parliament can understand the true pulse of the people when they demand for an all-party government, a consensus within Parliament, and understand that the majority party in Parliament has lost their mandate, and select a person who will be acceptable by the people. So, between these two options, which do you think should be done? And if there is a third option, please do educate the public.
Sean, that's a very interesting point that you raised, and the two options. But unfortunately, no. This constitution that was introduced by Jawad in 78 or 77, I mean, harks back to all what was said at that time by Dr. Colina de Silva and all that. As long as you are there, it's okay. If somebody else comes in, a madman comes in, what will be the position? You know, the whole problem is absolute power corrupts absolutely. And here again, we have a system where there's absolute power on the executive president, which is wrong. There should be checks and balances. And I believe, in fairness, 19th Amendment brought in checks, certain checks. And I must say that Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe himself has said that, look, he is supporting the reintroduction of the 19th Amendment. He said that. And he has come on that basis. But as I said, unfortunately, the system doesn't permit for the people to influence the appointment of a president. It is the representatives, the 225, including the speaker, who have the right to vote, who influences, or rather who exercises the right to elect a president. Now, the important question is, will the 225 act according to the electorate or act according to their own will? And then if they act according to their own will they go back to the electorate and justify the action under the current circumstances? So that is a dilemma which each of those 225 would face. Am I to act according to my own conscience? And if I do act according to my own conscience, can I justify my electorate? Will I be elected next year or next time or whatever? So that is a matter which has to be a very delicate matter. Reflects back on what I said earlier. Well, look, we elected you, you represent our genius. You know, the people elect those who, and Parliament reflects the genius of the people, so don't criticize the 225. If the people have elected them, 225, it reflects the genius of the people who have elected them.
But President's Council Zaruk now, if
we elected President Gotabaya Rajapaksa as well, like people like you.
6.9 million
people.
6.9 million people,
including
me, including myself.
Right, anyway,
to be very honest.
Yeah, so I just want to.
So let me finish with Shalon.
Yeah, I just want to pick. I'll come back to Ms. Zaruk. I want to pick. Tell me what's going to happen on the 20th when the Parliament convenes. Can you elaborate by step so the people are aware? Is it going to be a secret ballot that's going to take place? What's the process, Gihan? Yes.
Mrs. Zaruk is answering my.
I said yes.
And
he's very much involved in the discussion. So.
No, anyway, so basically, if there's more than one candidate, that's when we go to the 20th.
Yeah.
If there's only one candidate, we don't go to the 20th. That candidate is merely declared president by the Secretary General of Parliament.
Like what happened in...
like what happened with DB Vijay, right? That's exactly what happened. But if there's more than one candidate, what we do is we go for a election where each parliamentarian has one vote, and then there's a scheduled form that is part of the Act itself, where you would have the name of each candidate and a little box next to the name, and you have to put your preferences. So like a general election, you have a preferential voting system in this election as well. So they can put one for their candidate, and they can put 2, 3 or 4 for whoever
Only
else.
4 preferences.
Yeah, that's right.
Dr. Gihan, but why a secret ballot?
That's basically how it is going to, I mean, the word secret is not used in the Act. But when you read the Act and understand how the process will take place, for example, each ballot paper is initialed by the Secretary General, and then it's folded into 2 and then put into that ballot box. So when you read it, you understand it is going to be a secret ballot. But then nothing is stopping a parliamentarian from revealing who they voted for. Yeah, even when the Speaker of Parliament, the Deputy Speaker of Parliament rather, was elected, you had some parliamentarians who sort of revealed their vote. There's nothing stopping parliamentarians from doing that. But when you read the Act, it appears to set out a process where it would be a secret ballot, where parliamentarians are not required to, either by voice or by hand, declare who they vote for. Instead, it would be through this ballot system. It's also required because of the preferential voting system, because it will be very cumbersome to be putting your hand up for your first preference and then putting your hand up again.
Yeah,
for
but
your
what happens?
preference.
Yeah, but what happens if there's a tie?
So hopefully there won't be a tie, right? Basically, the first step is if someone gets 50% plus 1 of the votes that are cast, right? So it doesn't need to be 113 votes that are cast, then that person becomes president automatically. If no one gets at least 50%, then what happens is we have to check how many candidates have actually contested. Say there are 3 candidates, you would eliminate the third candidate, and that candidate would have got some second preferences as well, as in people who voted for that candidate would have listed their second preferences. Those second preferences are then divided amongst the remaining candidates depending on who got those second preferences. If that process leads to 50% plus 1, then that candidate is declared. But say it's such a divided race that no one ends up getting 50 plus 1 even through all these processes, ultimately the candidate that got the majority of votes will be declared. And then to answer your question, if God forbid you have absolutely equal votes after counting second and third and fourth preferences, then of course you toss a coin and decide who's the president. Literally, that's what the act says.
So toss a coin.
No,
I mean, I'm basically being facetious there, but essentially the Secretary General will draw lots and decide who wins. It's no different to tossing a coin.
Right, it's no different to a toss, Mr. Zaruk.
Yeah. I mean, someone who knows how lots are drawn, you
someone picks it up and then he's entitled to vote.
Again, are you saying that Mr. Zaruk doesn't know how lots are drawn? How to toss?
I mean, tossing a coin and drawing lots, I mean, anyone knows it's the same thing.
Yeah, okay. So now, Bhavani, now in 2013, when Greece was in a mess, the EU IMF bailout package was $110 billion. When Pakistan was in crisis several months ago, just like Sri Lanka, they didn't have their foreign reserves deteriorating very rapidly. China came to help Pakistan, and now Pakistan is somewhat raising its head again. We saw Imran Khan being able to resoundingly win one of the electorates again as a former prime minister. But Sri Lanka, no one is coming to help us. Where is China? Where is India? India, of course, helped us, but India could do more. They have approximately $600 billion in their reserves, and I totally understand there's nothing saying a free lunch. But they could help us a little bit more. You can discuss with Japan. I remember Navin Disanaik on this very show was very focused and told us, guess what? Another $2 billion is coming from somewhere. And we asked him from where. Then he said it's secret. But then I asked him, is it Japan? Then he said, you are right. But Sri Lanka, what happened? We are a non-aligned country. We championed that cause. But who is there to rescue us? Isn't that a pity?
There's much to pity, I think, in terms of what's happening. But let's just look at what's the present status. The IMF had a team in Sri Lanka. They recognize how complex the situation is. We are yet to get to a staff agreement because there's a lot of issues that need to be addressed. I disagree in that the international community is not coming to our aid. India has given quite a bit of assistance so far. They are having, I think, a meeting tomorrow with groups in India to explore other issues, other possible packages. I think the US, Australia, they are looking at humanitarian assistance, but the crisis is such, I don't think one actor can come in. We are looking at a looming humanitarian crisis, but we are also needing to look at long-term assistance. So who is able to address this? But Shamir, the big question is we can't just look to the international community for assistance without getting our house in order. I mean, your whole point about justice, I mean, that's critical. If we can't give people the confidence that we are able to address rampant corruption, corruption that has been seen over the decades, not just under this government, over the decades, that's going to put off anyone who wants to come and give us assistance. If we have bloated public service, if we have such a large military as opposed to health, education sectors that are not getting assistance or budgetary allocation, that's a huge question in terms of the present crisis. So we have to get our house in order. To get our house in order, we need political stability. We need leadership.
Now let's talk about our neighbor India. India is to discuss about the Sri Lankan crisis through an all-party meeting on a way forward for the country. Sri Lanka, we are fighting about candidates. We are in a mess. Political parties should unite. They have to be able to elect one person to the post of president, unite around that president. Isn't that the need of the hour? At least take a cue from India. Look at what they're doing. They're having an all-party meeting to ensure that the Sri Lankan crisis is addressed and looked after. But look at Sri Lanka. What are they doing? Fighting for the top post of the country without even looking at the people's aspirations and what the people want.
So that's the nature of, unfortunately, our polarized political context. I mean, we can't seem to, the political leadership can't seem to come together at this unprecedented crisis. And it's a lot about individual agendas, politics, incentives, all of that. I mean, unfortunately, but that's not new. I mean, why are we surprised that this is happening? I mean, are we expecting something completely different in terms of the politicians who we've known play their own agendas? So I'm not surprised that there's so much fighting, but let's see what happens tomorrow in terms of nominations. Can the opposition come together and say there's one candidate? Can they do that? I'd like to see that happen.
Let's say the opposition says that they have one candidate who will be contesting the elections. Would they have a chance with the SLPP having a resounding majority in parliament? Because the SLPP has already told, at least a cross-section of it has told that they will support the candidature of Ranil Wickremesinghe. Another section has said that they have to support the candidature of Dalasalha Peruma. And we know that some parties are very independent about it. The TNA has not yet made a decision about it as well. So they have approximately 11 votes in parliament. That's very crucial. 10 along with Vigneswaran. Vigneswaran has one, so he is not a TNA, but a member of parliament. Yeah, so 11 members of parliament. Do you think the opposition candidate will stand a chance?
Well, Shamir, I think it's going to be who is going to be nominated. If it's Ranil Wickremesinghe and say hypothetically, if it's say Dalasalha Peruma, who is going to get the support of the SLPP? And I think there might be divisions we see. Again, because it's a secret ballot, we may not even know who votes which way. So there may be individuals publicly saying we're going to support so and so. There's no guarantee everyone's going to support that candidate. So this is something we will not know till the day. But one thing critical for the opposition is to come together at this moment. I think there are conversations happening. That seems to be the indicator from the statements made so far. So let's see what happens tomorrow. Because if they fail to come together at this moment, you're basically showing that the opposition is also very ineffective at this moment. So it's a critical time not just for the government but also for the opposition. It's, I think, incumbent of all of us to watch how the politicians act at this moment, because this is an unprecedented time. So,
Gad, there's a question for you from one of our viewers. Sure. Now, the speaker will also get an opportunity to cast a vote at this election, right? On the 20th.
Do you want me to answer?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, everyone gets to vote in this election.
If there's a tie, as we said before, can the speakers vote?
No.
It doesn't.
If there's a tie, there's only one process, and that is if you have lots cast, and then the Secretary General actually has a lot of discretion in terms of how that process takes place. But I think this is a very, very, very unlikely scenario, because there are so many other steps that take place before that to ensure that you don't end up with a tie. even a general election or even a presidential election where the people vote for the president, you have these processes, but you never think about a tie because that's such an unlikely scenario.
So Bhavani, there's a question for you from one of our viewers as well. Let me pose the questions, Jamal, and I'll give you an opportunity. The question says, I'm going to read it in full. Two of your panelists, that's Gehan and you of course, are opposing the state of emergency. Do you all still believe the protests have been peaceful thus far?
The protests that's been happening since
in the
March?
last few weeks.
I would say yes. I mean, I've been part of the protests. It's been largely peaceful. There's been incidents of violence, but the violence also has come from the state. One needs to recognize that. The protesters largely have been peaceful, and that's what's been remarkable about what's happened in Sri Lanka. A peaceful protest shook the political system in Sri Lanka and got the most powerful individual, the executive president, to flee and then resign. The violence came from different elements. One needs to recognize that, and that needs to be investigated. I'm not saying who's responsible for the violence, but there was intimidation used, there was harassment used, there were court orders that the authorities attempted to get to stop the protests. There were different tactics used to stop protests, and that came largely from the state. But the people, the thousands and the hundreds of thousands on the 9th of July, were largely peaceful.
I'd like to add to that actually.
Yeah, yes, of course, yeah.
I agree with Bhavani. It's largely peaceful. There have been incidents of violence. The question to ask is whether a state of emergency necessarily improves our chances of eliminating violence. Now, I'd like to take an example going back to May 9th. We recall that there was a state of emergency at that moment. A state of emergency had in fact been declared on the 6th of May. So when that May 9th episode took place, where thugs went into Gota Gogama and started attacking protests, we were in a state of emergency that day. When 70-odd parliamentarians had their houses burnt, we were in a state of emergency. So I think we have to question whether a state of emergency has ever been about protecting public property, protecting people from violence. It's never been about that.
So Gehan, in that sense, if we are in a state of emergency, even now as we speak, there is a state of emergency in the country. Being in a state of emergency, does it allow for arbitrary arrests to be made?
No, it does not. It would require emergency regulations to be issued where certain powers of arrest and detention are then exercised under emergency regulations. As far as I know, there are no emergency regulations. So this state of emergency is just window dressing in a campaign, as far as I'm concerned. But the point is that we can have the deployment of armed forces, we can have curfews imposed without a state of emergency. So if there is trouble, the president does have certain powers that flow from the public security ordinance. A state of emergency has nothing to do with that, unless you need additional powers under the emergency regulations. As far as I'm concerned, these powers have not materialized because we don't have emergency regulations. So then the question has to be asked, what does a state of emergency really do? What does it do for us? And I would say in terms of public security, it doesn't do much.
Gehan, a question for you from one of our viewers.
Yeah.
We are getting a lot of engagement today by our viewers on the show. So that's very important. If you have a question, 076-656-5353 is the number to call. And I would be glad taking your questions on the show tonight. So Gehan, because you spoke about the process in which the elections are going to take place on the 20th to elect the 8th executive president of the country, is marking preferential mandatory? Can you opt out without voting and marking a preferential vote on this particular day in question?
Yes, absolutely. Parliamentarians can spoil their vote. They cannot vote if they don't want to.
They can abstain.
They can abstain. Basically, when we count votes, it will be, the law itself says it's 50% plus 1 in terms of votes cast. That means you can sit in parliament and then not vote. Of course, if you don't vote, your name will be read out a second time, and there's a whole process to make sure that you haven't just fallen asleep. But ultimately, you do have the opportunity not to vote. There's nothing forcing you to vote if you don't want to.
So, do you think that some political parties may not vote on the 20th? Would that be a possibility?
I would think that would depend entirely on who the candidates are. If the candidates don't inspire anyone, and certain political parties want to take a moral stand, you might have a policy decision to abstain. But that will depend entirely on the candidates. And the way things are moving, I would say that it would be a mistake to abstain, because I think this is a moment in which political parties have a real duty to act and try their very best to make sure that the person that is elected to that office, that all-powerful office, is someone that will act in the public interest.
Dr. Gehan, now let's take some incidents that happened in the past. One thing that we saw was the fact that in the past, especially even during COVID-19, when the authorities came forward and said, you know, it's curfew has been declared, lockdown has been imposed in a certain area, people honored that statement. They took it seriously. They didn't move out of the house. I can remember being stuck in my house for months on end, sometimes not even being able to go out to get food. So that's how serious people took the word curfew. We remember during war times when the government said curfew, people respected it. People stayed indoors. But these days, we see that people are being misled when the Inspector General of Police announces and says, you know, curfew has been declared, and then the Bar Association questions, how do you declare curfew across such the IGP? How can the IGP declare curfew? So even when curfew is imposed, people don't respect it. Now, at a time when we are experiencing a crisis and people need to be listening to the authorities, when these kind of things happen, what kind of an impact would it have on establishing the rule of law?
Sure. I think that's an important question. Let me begin by saying that the people have the freedom of movement. That's a constitutionally guaranteed fundamental right. Now, that freedom of movement can be restricted by the state under certain circumstances. That's also in the Constitution. And the grounds on which this very important freedom can be restricted include national security, public health, public order. There are all kinds of grounds. So during COVID, when lockdowns were imposed, question marks were, the questions were raised as to whether this happened according to law. Because it was, after all, a restriction on a fundamental right. But there was respect in terms of that kind of curfew, because people believed that this was genuinely for public health reasons. Now, again, when there's a real crisis, there's an emergency, say there's a riot taking place, and curfew is imposed in an area, people may respect it because of that interest, public order, and sometimes it's security. But if people believe that curfew is being imposed for political reasons to suppress their dissent against that very state that is restricting their freedom, they will not respect it. And that is what we see. So as much as we need to foster the rule of law, and we need people to, respect certain orders, when those orders are, on the face of those orders, illegal, like the police curfews that were imposed the other day. There's no such thing as a police curfew. When they're illegal, I think citizens naturally resist. And also when they're done specifically to suppress dissent, citizens will naturally resist. So that's the difference between, say, a curfew done in good faith for public health reasons, or in good faith because there's an emergency situation, and curfew that is imposed in bad faith. And people can tell the difference.
Bhavani, now we say that the Aragalaya accomplished so much. There was so much that was won over by the Aragalaya. But to be a little bit more realistic and take a little bit of a deeper look into what really happened, we saw on the 9th of May, I believe. Yes, the 9th of May. There was an attack on the Aragalaya protest site, and there was a massive retaliation of the people. That was a point when the so-called movement became a bit violent. And it was only at that point that politicians responded, and the Prime Minister resigned. Then we again saw the same thing happening on the 9th of July, when people were planning to come to Colombo, but like Dr. Gehan said, illegal forms of curfew were imposed, and they were being suppressed, but still people turned up in the thousands. in the hundreds of thousands. And then they proceeded into the Prime Minister's residence, the Presidential Secretariat, and things got a bit violent there as well. And it was only at that point that the President, at a point when the President had to flee the country, it was only at that point that the President really resigned from his position. So when you say that peaceful protests won all of this, as a person who looks at these matters analytically, I find it a little bit hard to believe. It was only when these peaceful protesters became frustrated and it turned a little bit into violence that the politicians responded. We're seeing the same thing happen again now. And one could say that a state of emergency is being imposed in anticipation of such form of dissent from the people, at which point only, and at only which point, will the current politicians again respond. Your take on this?
Well, Shalini, if you look at the protests that's happened, I mean, you're simplifying quite a bit here, but if you look at the months-long protests, the first impact of the protests came in April, when the resignations of the then cabinet happened. Most of them resigned, including the then central bank governor. Now, if you look at the months-long protests, there's been, I'm not denying there was violence, but I would say largely they were peaceful. Now, when the first incidents of violence happened, that was the 31st of March. If you really look at what transpired there are questions whether that violence came from the protesters or some other elements. And that can be raised in so many other instances. So to say protesters were involved in violence or...
No, Bhavani, I'm not accusing the protesters of violence here, but I mean, we cannot deny the part that the state played in all of this violence,
and
even in the resignation
as well
of the Prime Minister. It was primarily supporters of the government, at least, who initially attacked. But what I'm trying to deduce is what really has the... Is the fact of the matter that only at a point when people grow so frustrated and lash out their anger in any way possible, which even could be dubbed as, illegal, violent protests.
Extremely.
Is it only at that point that politicians really respond? Because every time something like that happens, there is a response, and then we celebrate that response, and then we promptly go back to the same old system. Because the Prime Minister resigned, we thought there will be change, but no. The President appointed Ranil Wickremesinghe as the Prime Minister. We continued the same old fashion. Then there was another protest, now another celebration, and we're going back to the same old games. Prime Minister, acting President, is making statements, abolishing flags, abolishing the, honorary names of His Excellency, doling out presidential pardons, promising SLPP members of building their houses. Isn't this the same, Bhavani?
It is to some extent, but if you take a step back, the fact that we're even having this moment where there's immense pressure on the political leaders is something quite remarkable. If you asked me last year, would we be in this situation? Would our political leaders be even interested to hear the public? The answer would be no. So there is a change. Can we go the full hog? That's something to be seen. But there is a moment here. This is something we need to really look at and see how do you make it the most effective in a way. So for example, there is a call to bring system change. There is a call to abolish the executive presidency. There's a call to address corruption. There's a call to bring in checks and balances. All of this need to happen. I mean, today Transparency International said asset declaration. Now that's a call that's been there for several years. Now, can we make this moment the moment to put that pressure on the different actors, not just the 225, but all stakeholders to start these processes forward? So a protest can only do so much. But it's also incumbent on all of us, including lawyers like us, to take it forward, to push the legislative reform. So it opens spaces and moments that need to be used. But can I also go back to this whole issue of emergency? That's also something important that I feel more people are questioning. If you look at 2020 and 2021, when the lockdowns were imposed, people didn't question. I mean, some of us raised the whole question of where is the quarantine curfew coming from? There is no legal terminology. People just accepted it. When some of us raised this, I remember even lawyers came and pushed back and say, how dare you question this, because this is for the greater good. But it's a legality one needs to question. It's not the ad hoc, you have to challenge the ad hoc processes. So you also see now people questioning these things. If they feel there is an illegality or some process is being used for a political purpose, there is pushback. Now that's very important, because that shows there's increasing political accountability now. The president, the prime minister, whoever, cabinet ministers just can't act the way they just want to act. If a minister, we don't need to name names, is reported to be taking corruption, there's a huge outcry now. Now, whether there's actual accountability is another question, but there is an outcry. So compared to a few years ago or compared to even last year, there is a change. People are starting to question. That's a positive thing. Where that goes is now the next stage of it. We can't just keep protesting. We need to use this moment to bring in the reforms and ensure we don't repeat these mistakes again next year or in a few months.
So I want to pose a question to the three panelists with regard to the reform agenda that is supposed to be presented to the people of the country. At least that way, the people would know what these candidates have in mind. So we have 4 candidates right now, and how important is it, at least at tomorrow's parliamentary sitting, for these individuals, Ranil Wickremesinghe, if it be the case, Dana Salahapirma, Sajid Premudas, Anil Kumar Disanayake, to articulate the reform agenda for the country, the strategy for the country. Isn't that important? The question is for all three of you. So let's start with Jehan.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, because unlike election where the president is elected by the people, you don't seem to have these manifestos where you know what the agenda is, because the whole audience, as I said before, is parliament and parliamentarians, and we are more spectators. But I think if this was going to be a genuine election that really is in the public interest, they should be setting out their reform agenda. Now, we have a sense of what that reform agenda, as far as the opposition, the main opposition party is concerned, because they've put a bill on the table, and that bill proposes to abolish the executive presidency. It also proposes to minimize crossovers. It proposes to set up a new council of the state, in which you will have interaction between various segments of society. All of it is on the table.
But that's not going to help to keep the fire burning at home.
That is precisely the next point I want to make.
Yeah.
So these are all constitutional reform proposals. We need to also know what the new leadership will do in terms of the economy, how they will manage this crisis, how they will actually deal with the real core of this protest, which is ultimately economic, right? No one can really dispute the fact that the core of this protest is economic. And I think the candidate that inspires confidence in terms of dealing with those immediate economic concerns is the candidate that will enjoy the legitimacy of the people. So you're absolutely right as far as the reform agenda is concerned.
There would be, I think, there is no opportunity for any of the candidates to come out with a manifesto or a program of action that they intend to take. That provision is not there in the Act of 1982. Names have to be proposed, and that particular person who proposes the name has to be present there and along with him. And then after the names are proposed, if there are no other names other than a single name, then he'll be pronounced the president-elect. The others will have no say. But perhaps the reason is, this is confined to the 225 members only, not to a general electorate where you have to have a manifesto or a vision spelling out the program of work. So it is up to the 225 to decide as to who is the most suitable to be elected under the current circumstances. As Jehan quite rightly pointed out, the most important issue here is the economic factor, not the political factor.
Yeah, but don't you think, Mr. Zaruk, given the current circumstances, the people also have a right to know as to what these agendas are? Because Sajid Premadas's talks about abolishing the executive presidency, that is not the need of the hour. No. We have long queues. I've been in a queue for the last 4 days. I returned to the country on Friday and I was in a queue until 7 p.m. today to get some petrol. And I was only able to pump 10,000 rupees worth of petrol. Look at this. And then I'm right at the show.
I mean, you are lucky that you got some petrol. I have also been in the 4 days, just close to my house, and yet I couldn't get petrol at all. You know, by the time I reached even halfway through, there was no petrol, so I had to turn back, and I said, I am not going to wait there. You know,
at least,
luckily,
Zaruk, you can be happy that you voted for President.
No, at least again you are coming. You are rubbing salt on my wounds. Why do you want to do that?
You can be happy.
If it gives you some happiness,
at least mine.
If it gives you some happiness, and I am very happy to contribute towards it. Please, I love to keep you happy and keep on.
It's not rubbing it. It's not about keeping me happy.
So that's I'll tell you. But I'm telling you, the reason is you and I, whether we voted for him or to Mr. Premadasa, you may have voted for Mr. Premadasa. I would have.
At least I'm lucky I got petrol in 4 days. You voted for him.
I don't know. At least we are waiting for 4 hours. If Mr. Premadasa was there, we had to wait for eternity. But anyway, I'll leave all that aside. Let's get back to the problem. So the point is this: the issue is here that, as quite rightly Jan pointed out, the major issue here is the economic issue. You know, and the people are waiting for this. As you said, try to eliminate the queues, stabilize the price of goods, even at this level, stabilize it. Let it not go on, and then give us the fertilizer in time, the medicines in time, and go on. So that is what the people want. So then they will say I mean, then the point here again is, Shamir, as you quite rightly said, the electorate will not bring pressure on the MP. It's the other way about today. It is the MP who brings the pressure on the electorate. So if that is so, the electorate could bring pressure on the MP and say, hey, they are not. You have to vote for so-and-so. He is the one who is going to give us all these benefits. And we are convinced that you should vote for him. Now, he is not going to consult the electorate. He is not going to have, in these circumstances, in this environment, he is not going to summon his electorate. Because most of them can't face the electorate. Between you and me, very honestly. So they will all decide within the precincts of the parliament to whom they should vote. No, and I don't know what factors will motivate them to vote ultimately. You know, we don't know.
Mr. Zaruk, you were speaking about the fact that...
If you don't mind,
let
me pick Bhavani's thoughts.
Definitely.
Yes, Bhavani, what are your thoughts? To instill public confidence, because that is what is diminishing at the moment. That is what has deteriorated during the last few years in Sri Lanka. How important is it for the candidates to articulate what they have in mind or what they have in store for a better tomorrow? At least I'm just being optimistic.
Extremely important, Shamir, because this is going to be the person who's going to lead Sri Lanka in the future, at least into the next couple of months and 2020 up to 2024, barring nothing happens in the meantime. So it's very important they take a position. I agree with the fellow panelists. They have to show what their plan is in terms of the economic recovery. But economic recovery alone is not going to solve all the problems. We are in this crisis because of the abuse of power of a particular office. If you look at the policies, the mismanagement of the last 2.5 years, it came from the executive presidency. So what Gihan said is very right. We have to look at who is going to bring in the reforms, in what form. Is there going to be a plan to abolish the executive presidency? This is the time. But not just that, not just executive presidency goes home, is revoked, but also can we ask the 4 candidates or whoever is going to be the candidates, what about their position on asset declaration? As far as I know, neither one has declared their assets, and some of them have been in parliament for a few decades. What is their position in terms of corruption? There's a lot of talk in terms of before elections, we'll do this, we have all these files, we'll investigate. You know, nothing really has led to these investigations leading to prosecutions and actual convictions. So can we have their positions in terms of what is it that they're going to do? So I think in terms of abolishing executive presidency, economic revival, asset declaration, corruption, but also I would want to ask them what is their plan in terms of parliament. So it's not just abolishing the executive presidency, it's also strengthening parliament. If you look at the committees, the work they've been doing, for example, COPE, public finance, they have a very specific role in terms of accountability and transparency. But they also have been weakened because of standing orders, practices by this government, various politicians. Can we ask the candidates what is their position in terms of strengthening institutions, strengthening parliament, including committee systems? So there's a whole lot of questions we can ask them. But let's start with their own track record, asset declaration.
Yeah, but Bhavani, right now, the need of the hour right now at this very moment of time is to find solutions to the economic crisis in the country. We've not heard anything concrete from Andrew Kumar Dissanayake yet on how he intends to revive the country's economy. We've not heard anything concrete from Dalla Salahat Perum either. We know that individuals like Dr. Harshil Silva from the SJB has been talking very vociferously with regard to the country's economy and so on and so forth, but we've not heard anything concrete again from the SJB candidate as well, how to keep the fire in the kitchens burning. That's what's important. So in a situation like that, don't you think it is at least prudent for these members who are going to be in the forefront on the 20th, if the situation is the same scenario that we're talking about, or it's the same status quo, that they inform the public, hold media briefings. If they don't have the opportunity in Parliament, hold a media briefing. And the media would love to carry what their ideologies and what their thinking is. Isn't that the way to move forward?
I don't dispute with that, Shami. I think we need to hear from them in terms of their plans, in terms of what is their program, because we are going in for a critical time. But we also need to remember it's not one individual who's going to be able to address this. We shouldn't think about this savior mentality. That's how we got to this situation. We need to hear from them, and ideally a plan that includes experts. A kind of technocratic model, but experts that have a say. So I don't think the four candidates that we are aware of, neither one is an economist. They need to then say, okay, we do listen to the economists, we do need to listen to the experts, and this is our plan. Neither one has come up with that, but please, we need to ensure that it's not this savior mentality that we move forward, because we need to learn lessons from our recent past as to how we got to this situation.
So, Mr. Razik Zaruk, you were speaking about, being stuck in a fuel queue and all of that. True.
And not being able to pump
and
petrol.
not being able to pump petrol.
Unfortunately, even after voting. Right.
Thank you, Shami.
Yeah.
No, nothing.
I didn't hear that.
Never mind.
President's Counsel Zaruk, we too had similar problems. Mine a little bit deadlier than yours, of course. I was traveling in the bus. I only had one hand and one foot inside the bus. The other hand and the other foot were outside of the bus. I was clinging on to dear life, as the saying goes, and praying to God that I make it through about a 5-kilometer ride on that bus. And it's very, very scary.
It's very scary indeed. I want to tell you my school days, one of my experiences. Those we used to cling on to the bus and the pole came onto my hand.
Right. Mr. Zaruk, we'll talk about all that.
So,
Just answer this question.
President's Counsel Zaruk, so my question to you really is, the initial question that I posed to you as to how we can gain stability. I mentioned two options. Either the people must compromise and say, you know what, we're not going to get the best president, we're not going to get the president who we want, but let's just go with whoever Parliament elects, right? And the second one, since Parliament already knows what the people want, I refuse to believe that parliamentarians don't really know what the electorate wants. I think the entire country is in unison. They've said that we want a person who can form some sort of consensus in Parliament. And clearly, by the looks of it at least, and by the protests that have been erupting in the country, I think it's safe to say that the acting president might not be that person to create consensus in Parliament. So, again, my question to you is, what do you think should be done? Should the people compromise, and go with whoever Parliament elects? Or should Parliament compromise on their personal agendas, on their own whims and fancies, and appoint who the people want?
I think once the president is elected by Parliament under this process, the president represents the whole country.
No, true. You're still evading my question.
No, I'm not evading. I'm coming to it. I'm coming to it. I mean, the point is that once he comes in, but you are missing a very important point here, Shalom, that all these presidents, all four, say, look, we want to get rid of our powers. We are going to introduce the 19th Amendment back. You know, so once you introduce the 19th Amendment back, the most important person who is going to be is not the president anymore. And we do not know, and that's fine, they're doing soonest. The most important person and who the performer would be the Prime Minister.
But President's Council, Zaruk, I mean...
So I don't think the president of a country will, or whoever who is elected, if he is going to pledge, or who has, they have all pledged, that they are getting back to the 19th Amendment, including Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe. So if that is so, you know, he doesn't play, he plays only a secondary role.
No,
the
but
Prime
again...
Minister in Parliament will play the most important role.
But again, President's Council, Zaruk, can I have a direct answer to that question?
Ask me a direct question, ask me a direct question.
What do you think, who should compromise, the people or Parliament? Who should compromise?
Compromise?
Who should compromise on the election of the new president? I just explained it.
It is confined to Parliament. So it is Parliament, the members, as I said, the members represent the electorate.
So the parliamentarians should compromise on their own whims and fancies and elect. But what do you think will happen? Do you think that will happen?
I hope so. I don't know how it will happen. I can't predict. I'm not a soothsayer.
So, Mr.
But
Zaruk,
that is it. The powers are vested with the MPs. So it's the MPs who should compromise.
So, Mr. Zaruk, if acting President Ranil Wickremesinghe is to become the president in another 72 hours or so, do you believe the people will fall in line and rally around him, or do you believe that the struggle will continue?
That is to be seen. That's to be seen. We don't know. We don't know. That's
because,
to be seen.
Because essentially...
That is to be seen, because some of these parties, political parties who have now infiltrated into this Aragalaya are saying, look, we will not accept it. You know, so that's to be seen. That's
because there is a school of thought, Mr. Zaruk, that Ranil Wickremesinghe has been a proxy for the Rajapaksas over a period of time.
Thought, yeah.
So that is essentially what the people wanted. They wanted corruption to end. So they said, Gota, go home. Then they asked the Prime Minister to go home, former Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa.
We'll see how he performs. We don't know. Let's give him and see if he is elected. I'm talking about
yes, hypothetically, yes.
Totally hypothetical.
Yes.
In the event he is elected, we'll see how he performs. I mean, you must give him a chance and see whether he is going to be, in which case the people will not accept it. You know, my concern is that the Aragalaya should remain the Aragalaya, and the Aragalaya should not, develop into a Viplavya. That's my fear. But and I don't like the current trend. And that there are strong forces at the moment who are operating to convert this Aragalaya into a Viplavya.
But
and they have made open statements on this in the media.
But would you say the Aragalaya turned into a Viplavya only because the state pressured it to become?
No, I don't say that. I don't say that. State didn't pressurize it at all. You know. Never.
What about the 9th of May?
9th of May was a very wrong decision. I mean, whoever who took it, and it more or less accelerated it. You know, it was a catalyst that accelerated. But look at the repercussions. Not only they ended up in the Beira, 70 houses were burnt. A member of Parliament was killed, lynched. Two other members were nearly lynched. They escaped. You know, that's a very bad thing. That was a very, very bad move, you understand? And that is the catalyst that could accelerate this Viplavya. And my concern is that we are a nation and proudly who have exercised the franchise, changed governments over the period of 70 years with the franchise. We had accepted universal franchise in 1931, all that. And government should change by the use of the vote of the people. And not by those who cannot come into Parliament by the vote of the people should not make use of this as an
Ranil
opportunity
Wickremesinghe.
for them to
Case
go
in
into
point. Mr. Saruk, Ranil Wickremesinghe, 25,000 votes in Colombo. People rejected him.
That is the democracy, you know, what can you do?
Yes,
that is the process in,
that's
that is
exactly
the flaw.
what we're talking about.
My dear, that is the flaw in the system. What can you do? I mean, you have a first past the post system was taken away. And you have introduced this system right away. And this is it. That is why I blame, from the beginning, the entire constitution was changed, and we should change the whole constitution, throw it out, and bring in a new constitution. This 1977 constitution has done more damage than...
That is what was promised by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa.
That was not only by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, my dear Shamir, it was promised by every president.
Every president.
From 1994 downwards. From Mrs. Kumaratunga downwards.
From President Chandra Kumaratunga, then
downwards,
came,
everybody.
Then there was a constitution that was tabled in Parliament.
And that was burnt. I remember.
Yeah,
and they nearly burned Parliament then, at that time. I thought Guy Fawkes was to be re-elected after 200 years or more, little less than 200 years. So that is why you're right. So everybody promises, but nobody wants to change it because power, once you have in power, it corrupts you. So you don't want to give up your power. You know, that is the process. Even the 19th Amendment was, again the 20th Amendment was brought in for what reason? Leave the 19th Amendment, we would not have had all these problems. I'm just telling you.
Is this the end of the Rajapaksa political dynasty in Sri Lanka?
I don't say so. Memories are. I told you, I just told you before that Marcos took 30 years to come back. I mean, when Marcos was chased out of the country, I mean, they thought that's the end of the Marcoses.
Mrs.
But
Zaruk,
then Bonbon came up after, Bonbon, no, he's known as.
Yeah.
He came up after 30 years. People have short memories, my dear Shamir.
Mrs. Zaruk, you were
A
criticizing...
new generation will come up. They will forget
What is
everything.
it? Which generation?
A new generation will come up.
A new generation will come up.
And they will forget about everything. They will not know about it. Now, who remembers the 1971 insurrection? Who remembers 83,
I was not
87?
even born, but I remember. I know what happened.
71?
We know
71.
stories.
71.
Oh, I see.
President Council Zaruk, you criticized the 20th Amendment, but I distinctly remember you participated on one of our shows that I hosted called The Role of Law. And I distinctly remember you saying, let's give this president the power and see what happens.
Yeah, quite right.
In favor of the 20th Amendment.
Yeah.
You said...
that was then. And
yes, that was then. So now that you did give the president the power and saw what happened, what do you think?
But that is not, it's not the 20th Amendment that created this mishap, no? It's not the 20th Amendment. It is wrong policies, wrong advice that was brought in. And this is an economic crisis.
True.
That is what happened. If not for the farmers getting out, firstly, burning effigies and saying that they were the first to start the Argadaya. Remember that.
Mrs. Zaruk, you have little memory, Mrs. Zaruk. You are right when you say that people forget in Sri Lanka very quickly.
Yeah, I'm also one of those who probably...
2019 tax cuts, can't remember.
Yeah, I'm coming to that. I'm coming to that.
But
I was coming to that. I was coming to that. You're right. First was the tax cut. No?
Yeah.
First was the tax cut before the furniture. You're right. Tax cut. I was coming. It's one of those. I said series of errors. The tax cut, the fertilizer issue, then came the
Not going to the IMF?
IMF. No, that came much later.
Much later.
Then in between, the other thing was this fertilizer.
You said that twice now.
We said it twice.
Yeah.
What about the sugar scam?
Sugar scam?
Sugar scam.
Garlic scam?
Garlic scam, not going to the IMF. Remember how the former governor of the central bank...
I was one of those who saw. And we busted up. Let's reflecting on the mistakes that we had done, let's admit it. We busted up
$3 billion.
Accountability,
where must it lie?
$3 billion we busted up by trying to keep the rupee at 200.
Pegging the rupee against the dollar.
Accountability, where must it lie now? Now, who should be held responsible for this mess that we are in, Mr. Zaruk? Who should be? Now, you're a learner, council,
I would say the government.
Council.
The government.
Who should be held responsible?
The government.
Who? Government. Who? Now, it's very easy to say the government.
That has to be more specific. We have to go into it, a commission, and find out who's specific. I can't often say. Someone can say, well, look, these are policy advisors.
Now, the baby Grusha is going to be taken from the Chalk Circle Bridge from one end to the other as the Rajapaksa baby was
Shamir, let's
taken
talk-
from one end to the other.
Shamir, tell me something about. Let's talk about fertilizer, for example. Now, ultimately, who is it to be responsible for it? Ultimately, the Minister of Agriculture, who vociferously supported it, or is it? Some say that it's Mr. Padenia and Reverend Ratana who did it, who promoted it. One was motivated by the fact that
owners had to stop somewhere. Mr.
no, I'll tell you. Yes, some had to, but he says, look, because of the kidney diseases, the GMOA was involved in it. And
Right.
Ratana says he wanted to make this a country without
Mr. Zaruk,
Vasa Vicen Torre.
Mr. Zaruk, at least now, let's seek justice to what has happened in the country. Let's not protect these people who have put us in this mess. Look at what the
No one
people
is
are
trying
doing.
to protect
20
them.
people have died.
No, they
in
are
queues.
accountable. The biggest
20
accountability
people have
is.
died in queues. You're talking about two.
No,
parliamentarians.
Shamir, I'm not talking.
No,
I'm not trying to
20
protect anybody.
people.
I'm telling you when you
20
wanted to
people.
know. I was telling you.
No,
No,
20
Shamir, you're right.
people. No,
But
20
ultimately,
people have died in queues.
it is the people who will decide and who will throw them out. You know,
That's
and
what-
then appoint a new government.
That is what President Mahindra Rajapaksa said when he was interviewed by Al Jazeera. You know what he said, Mr. Zaruk?
I remember what he said.
You remember? What did he say?
I remember what he said.
What did he say?
Except the people will throw him out.
We'll throw him out. And that time has come, and this is the time.
So they have already thrown him out. No?
Yeah, they have thrown him out, not to the wishes of the people. People just don't want them to be thrown out. People want justice. Did you read the Sunday papers, Mr. Zaruk, this week?
Yeah.
If you read the political commentary or the political editorial that was done by Sunday Times, it says one of the Rajapaksa sons who were very close to the Dubai money incident or a case has suggested President Gotabaya Rajapaksa to give a private jet from Dubai to pick him up from Male, and that jet has not come. That's a different story altogether. But this is what the Sunday Times reported this weekend,
It was in the editorial.
which is the editorial, the political commentary done by, I think, by Iqbal Ataz. if
No,
I'm
not on the
mistaken.
editorial. He doesn't do the
Yeah,
editorial. Editorial done by
the political commentary. But
Oh.
the question mark is, from where did they find this money?
Does he say that he financed it? I didn't read that part.
No. I'm
Did
saying,
he say that he financed it or he arranged for it?
No, he arranged for it. But from where is the money?
We don't know that.
We-
Maybe they've
so
got
now
some
can we
friends.
just leave them,
So
leave them aside and say,
did the private jet come? It didn't come. No,
you all know what happened, Mr. Zaru?
I don't know.
You don't know what happened?
About the private jet, I don't know.
All right, so there was no private jet.
I don't know. It came from. There was no private jet. He
There
took a
was no
Saudi
private
Air flight. No.
Yeah.
He took a
there
Saudi
was-
Air flight.
Yeah, he took a Saudi Air flight to Singapore. So anyway, there's no point of crying over spilled milk. Let's look at a way forward. Now we are in this abyss right now as learned lawyers.
So let's have a new president, whoever it is, and then look for a
I'm
way
not done with
forward.
my question, Mr. Zaruk. You have to let me
Ah,
ask the
sorry,
question,
sorry.
pose the question. Right, okay. Right, so what is the way forward? I want to pose that question again to the three of you and then go for a short commercial break. And then let's talk about what Sri Lankans must do right now because they don't have an opportunity. They
I
are
think,
supposed to look and wait until the parliament decides on the 20th.
Shamir, just
Yes,
to answer
sir.
you straight away in a very short way.
Yeah.
The first, whoever may be the president and whatever the government that he is, the first thing is immediately to eliminate these queues, make these things available, and then stabilize the prices, and then go for an election. That is those are the priorities as far as I'm concerned. To be very short in my answer,
Right.
that's the priority.
right. How these queues should be.
The logistics are how to work. That we make it goods available, and how it is being done is a different setup. Those are the decisions that they should take as politicians, and along with the technocrats to advise them and to negotiate with the international bodies, as you said, or to all the friendly countries, as you said about Pakistan and all that. So and it's up to them. I'm not telling them how they should do it and why they should do it. That's up to them to work it out. But those are the priorities.
Okay. Bhavani?
Shamir, so definitely there's no doubt we need to address the economic crisis. Addressing the queues, making sure the essential items are there, the medicines, ensuring people have 3 meals a day. The humanitarian crisis is no doubt unprecedented. and that requires attention. That said, we should not ignore the whole political question. We shouldn't be going back to a situation where there is chaos, a power vacuum, so we need to ensure that there are things in place to hold the politicians accountable, but also bring in the necessary reforms. The reforms also should include addressing corruption, money laundering, addressing the whole issue of assets that seems to be very questionable. But there is also the other dimension of justice, of accountability, of reconciliation, and this is an issue we have not talked about in this program. You know, while we're talking about an economic crisis, we have ethno-nationalism thriving in this country. We have politicians as well as religious leaders who are espousing that minorities are second-class citizens. So we need to not just think about the economic crisis, we need to think about the political question, but we also need to ensure that we don't repeat we address the root causes of the conflict, but we don't repeat the mistakes. So there's a lot of things that need to happen. Addressing the economic issues are paramount, but let's not ignore the other issues as well.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I won't repeat the priorities, but let me say this. I don't think someone whose number one priority is political survival can help this country navigate through a crisis. It has to be someone whose number one priority is the actual management of the crisis. You can't have a person who's juggling too many balls actually navigating us through this crisis. So I think that reality is something that we have to confront. Ultimately, we need a good faith leadership. And what I see happening right now is leadership that is not acting in good faith, and a leadership that is prioritizing their own political survival over management of the crisis. So even if I agree with all these priorities, I think that is something that has to be put as a number one step if we're going to get out of this crisis.
So what should be the priority, Gihan? Is it to address the political problem, the crisis that we are in politically, or the economic crisis that we are facing at the moment?
No, so as I said before, we have to deal with the economic crisis because that is number one.
Number one.
What I'm trying to say is if someone in that position of decision making is fundamentally politically insecure, you're not going to have a management of that crisis.
Right. So I want to ask you a question, Gihan, because of the fact that you've closely worked with a political party in question as well over the last few years. But just getting into the nuts and bolts of my question, do you think that if Sajith Premadasa was appointed as the Prime Minister of the country instead of Ranil Wickremesinghe, hypothetically, when he was appointed, Ranil Wickremesinghe was appointed as the Prime Minister, things would have been a bit different?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and that, I think, goes back to the fundamental demand of the people. What was that demand? It's a slogan, right? There was no ambiguity. And I think any leader who put themselves in between the people and that fundamental demand would have immediately, betrayed that cause. So not only Sajith Premadasa, all the other leaders who were invited to take that position, when they rejected it because of this fundamental reason, I think they did the right thing. Now, if they had taken that position, perhaps we wouldn't have actually secured the resignation of the president. We don't know what would have happened. But the fact of the matter is that the person who did take that position was also associated with the Rajapaksa presidency, and the legitimacy of the government didn't improve, which is why even after that appointment we had protests escalating to the point where the president in fact had to resign. And actually, Shalan's question is a fantastic question. What it really takes for someone to act is peaceful protest sufficient? It's something that we're going to have to reflect on for many years to come.
Right.
But
so, yeah.
the point is ultimately that any decision that was taken at that stage that would have come across as a betrayal of the people's demand would have certainly been the wrong decision.
Right. So again, one more question on the same lines.
Yeah.
We saw the manner in which in April, Harin Fernando went on to say that he's willing to support the candidature of Harsha de Silva as the president of the country. At least let's give him an opportunity to run the country. And in fact, he came on the show after he crossed over from the SJB to the government ranks, took a portfolio as well. He said that the post of the Minister of Finance is available or vacant for Dr. Harsha de Silva. He can come and take it any time, and Ranil Wickremesinghe would happily give that position to him. So do you think that if a national government was created at that point of time, today things would have been much different for Sri Lanka, and that only required a little bit of sacrifice from political parties?
It would have been a sacrifice for the wrong reasons, because ultimately, I go back to my initial point, if that kind of national government was seen to be protecting the president at the time, it would have not had any legitimacy. And it would have been ludicrous for someone to have gone into that government, even for a good cause, even to really help steer the ship, when in fact that participation would have provided a shield for the president of the time, and the people would have continued to protest. So and the protest would have been escalated as it did. So I think anyone who desisted has been completely vindicated, and those who actually crossed over have had to resign, and their legitimacy has taken a major hit. So I think when we look back at that moment, those who took a moral decision made the right choice. I have no doubt about it, because for whatever said and done, we have gone down this path, and we have ultimately secured the resignation of a president as a result of that escalation.
Dr. Gyan, do you think that the SJB should hold the post of Prime Minister under President Ranil Wickremesinghe at the top helm in government?
That's a decision that the SJB, if it is put into that position, it's an unenviable position, because then it has to decide whether Ranil Wickremesinghe also is someone that lacks the legitimacy of that office, and we have indications that he might or he might not. So it's a big political decision, and I don't think there's a right or wrong answer right now for that. I would be sympathetic either way, because it's a terrible position to be in, not only in terms of the country but also for the party, because you have a party that has broken away from the UNP. It wants to break from that entire position, and then it is invited to function under that very person that they broke away from.
Yeah.
So I think, let me finish my point, please. If I can finish my point, I think it's a very unenviable position. But the person who makes the argument that it needs to be done for the national cause, in the public interest, I think that is a strong argument. And it would be something that has to be considered.
Just something arising out of this. Yeah. Just now arising out of what you said.
Yeah.
What if where we stand if it's going to be an all-party government?
I don't understand.
If they want for all parties to come into the cabinet.
Let me be very clear. I advise all kinds of political parties. I don't advise only one political party. So I can't speak for one political party. But I can say that at this particular juncture, if there is a president that can enjoy some semblance of political legitimacy, all parties must participate in that national government. I can say that.
So, Dr. Zaruk, we have Mr. Zaruk, not Dr. Zaruk, President's Council Zaruk. We have a question from one of our viewers. I'm going to read the question in full, Mr. Zaruk. This is not a question that is coming from me. So, if you want to duck the question, you can duck the question, not respond to it as well. Because I don't want you to think that I'm posing this question to you. So the question is, ask your learned guest, Mr. Zaruk, how he could have given the last president a chance, especially when he came in with culture of white vans, intimidation, press, racism, etc. And why he did not give the same chance to his opponent. One thing for sure, had he done that, we would have definitely not have been in the position that we are in now.
You're talking about white van.
white vans,
The white van
intimidation,
culture started from
killing.
during the time of Mr. Premadas. You know, and the white van would take your Lakshman Pereira and your own colleagues, journalistic colleagues, what's that gentleman who was taken and who was the founded, famous name?
Richard D'Souza.
Richard D'Souza. Richard D'Souza. The white van culture was not started by this government or by any government. That has been there from 1996. And I remember Ronnie Guru Singh telling me at that time, the late Ronnie Guru Singh, who died along with Mr. Premadas. And I asked him why all this. He said, look, well, some of our mentors have become our tormentors. So we have to get rid of them. So I think that is the answer. I would say that this is our culture. So, and all governments from 96 downwards have had white vans.
We are talking in particular.
No, I'm just telling you.
Yeah,
all white vans have white vans. Yes,
yeah,
I'm telling you, white van is not something
No,
that
no, but
started by any
intimidation,
particular government of recent times. It has a history. It has a history.
So on and so forth.
It has a history. It has a
Shami,
history.
if I may come in there,
Yeah.
I think there is an indifference to human rights issues. There is an indifference. We have to acknowledge the fact that
That's the greater picture.
that people are indifferent to the fact that someone is associated with gross human rights violations. They're willing to vote for them if the promise is vistas of whatever and splendor, right? I mean, whatever that phrase is. I think, and I think that's why the cynic can look at this Aragale and say this is ultimately economic. This doesn't mean that there's been a major shift in the seismic shift in the polity, right? So we need to think of this thing in terms of the full picture and take things from all angles. And I would say that there is an indifference, and I also think that one of the big lessons that we need to learn from this whole experience: how did this man end up in this office? And how did 6.9 million people vote for him? I think we need to also hold accountable the entire public relations machinery that got him there. We had a narrative that was put down over and over and over again until people believed it, that this person can do stuff. He's a guy who can get things done. We had a song that is now ironically sung, right? So I think ultimately we need to also question how much we believe those kinds of PR machines. Whether we are going to encounter that in the future again, and we say no, we're going to be skeptical. We need to see people actually delivering before we actually, join on the bandwagon and believe in this narrative that is put forward.
Particularly the social media about
Yeah.
Ms. Zaruk, you want to answer Rehan's question? Why did the 6.9 million people vote?
Yeah, because as Jan himself provided the answer. They were convinced that
I was convinced.
I was convinced.
Yeah, you have to say I was convinced because you are.
I thought you were convinced.
No, you.
No,
You have to say
I was
was
convinced. I said, you were convinced. Yes.
No,
I was one of those. One of the 6.9 million. I started off by saying that. There's no hesitation about it. I know. But the point is this, as you quite rightly said, the media was very powerful. And then, of course, he also had a track record at that time. He had a track record at that time, and he was a doer. Everybody thought he's a doer. He's a doer. And that was completely highlighted in the media, and particularly in the social media. That's the one that took us up.
Right, Mrs. Zaruk. I want to. We've been unfortunate as a nation that we are in this situation at the moment. We were well and good up until January. I still recollect how former chairmen of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, individuals in the caliber of Mr. Rajendran Tyagaraja, Vish Govindasamy, Vish Suresh Shah, came on the show and said, let's not pay that $500 million that we have. Let's save it for the nation. What did the former governor of the central bank do the very next day? He went ahead, tweeted saying, individuals who are saying that we can't pay are now making an outcry about the fact that we have the money to pay, but we are not able, we should not pay. What happened? Several months down the line, look at where the country is, beginning April onwards. Look at where we are, and accountability has to lie somewhere, Mr. Zaruk. Unfortunately, that accountability seems to be not going anywhere at this very moment, with the acting president trying to look after the interests of the Rajapaksas as told and articulated by the opposition parties. So we're going for a short commercial break. When we come back, we discuss on the topic of Sri Lanka's uprising forces out a president, but has it left a system in crisis? We're in conversation with Attorney at Law Bhavani Fonseca, senior researcher from the Center for Policy Alternatives, Mr. Razik Zaruk, President's Counsel, Attorney at Law Dr. Gihan Gudafilaka. We'll be right back. Stay connected, stay with Face the Nation.
COVID-19 සඳහා ආරක්ෂිත පියවර. ජනයා වැඩි වශයෙන් සිටින ස්ථානයන්හි ගැවසීම මගහරින්න. රෝගය ආසාදිත පුද්ගලයන් හමුවීමට නොයන්න. මුහුණ, මුඛය, නාසය සහ ඇස් ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න. අනවශ්‍ය ගමන් බිමන් යෑමෙන් වළකින්න. මුඛාවරණය ඉදිරිපස ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න.
A brand new year, a year of hope, a year of aspirations and people looking for inspiration.
Our software engineers, our IT expertise are, not second to anyone.
A proper investigation led by the CID, this will be swept under the carpet.
Understanding about the stock market, the fundamentals, the economy, that is very important.
Entire ownership of this reclaimed land as well as the governance of Port City are all under the government of Sri Lanka.
No planet, no people, no business.
Yes.
And this is the simple thing about Biznomics.
Your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. Biznomics, Saturday and Sunday at 5 p.m.
Kidney diseases have plagued the villages of Madukare for many years. For 335 families that once relied on impure water, there's some hope. A water purification project by Gammadda. Gammadda, for the people, by the people.
Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. We open the floor for questions today from our guests as well. Usually a practice that Charlene follows when he moderates Face the Nation. I thought I will follow suit tonight. And I did share a number to share your questions, and you all did actively engage today. You all can always actively participate with our discourse, with our dialogue that we are having with our panelists. By logging on to our Facebook page, liking our Facebook page, and then directly sending your questions to us via the messenger. And if not, you can always message us on 0766 565353. We're in the final round. No questions are going to be asked from the panelists in the final round. You can sum up, rebut to the points, but make sure not to bring in new arguments in the final round. Just keep in mind Bhavani, Mr. Zaruk and Gihan. And let's start off the final round with Mr. Razik Zaruk, President's Counsel.
Well, I have not much to add than what was all you extracted from us during the last 2 hours. As I said, whoever who comes, the priority is to stabilize the country's economy and to go ahead with it. And it's a formidable task. And as you quite rightly said, we need the assistance of so many, both local as well as foreign countries, to come in, and particularly our friends, aid groups, various countries who are prepared to come into aid. And I don't know, to some extent, how we have generally, I won't say antagonized, but put into a position where they're silent rather than vociferously coming forward to assist us, as they have done in some of the other countries. So I believe that is a formidable task that has to be achieved. And hopefully whoever the president who comes, I hope will have the cooperation of all the other parties. And if at all you cannot have a consensus to have a all-party government, at least to have the support to go through this crisis and to seek the assistance undoubtedly, not only as IMF. I don't think IMF support alone is enough, but we need friendly countries to come in to our aid, whether it is Russia, China, Japan, India. Of course, India has been. And also, we must also tap, there has to be a process of reconciliation. Tap the Middle East countries who can always help us and who have enough of resources to help us, because most of our employees, our foreign exchange remittances are from the Middle East. And there has to be every effort to restore back the remittances that we receive into former levels, at least bringing it to about $67 billion a year. Then we have to revive the tourism industry and also see that our price, but the subsidy should be limited, should be aimed at towards families who need such financial support, so that they could overcome those things. And then our education system has to be completely revamped and schools should start. And I think it's a long agenda, it's a very big agenda, and I think the country should have the patience and the ability to come out of it. And I hope we will do that, in as much as very soon we would face an election and sort it out and bring in more stability across the country. So those are my hopes and aspirations as far as the future is concerned.
Thank you very much, Mr. Razik Jaruk, President's Counsel. I now move my attention to Attorney at Law Bhavani Fonseca, Senior Researcher, Center for Policy Alternatives.
So Shami, today I think what we've discussed is just a multitude of crises, and I feel like looking at this whole overwhelming task. But let's recognize the fact that people have lost all confidence of the political elite. And this crisis is very much a governance crisis. So if we don't address structural reforms, address the rule of law and the whole issue of accountability, political accountability, but holding elected officials as well as administrators accountable for what Sri Lanka is going through right now. But we also need to recognize impunity is entrenched in Sri Lanka for decades. Even when there's been opportunities, very few things have happened with accountability. So I come back to this point, there is a moment now, and the positive side of it is the last few months have seen things open up. People challenging the status quo, questioning officials, seeing the most powerful individual leave office, seeing massive resignations. So I think there's this kind of shift that's happening where there is a citizen taking charge. Citizen, the reawakening of the citizen in Sri Lanka. This is so important. While we talk about economic crisis, political instability, what do we do next? I mean, without going towards the violence. So I would say looking to what happens this week is key, but holding those who come to office is going to be critical. But building those blocks, one individual is not going to help. It's systems, it's structures, it's ensuring there's trust in terms of who is going to be able to take the country forward, but also communicating what is possible in the immediate, what is possible in the long term. So there's a whole lot of things, but ending with the fact that what we have now is unprecedented, but it's also because people have brought this. So we need to also ensure that we listen to the people, but also work in terms of building this country through democratic processes. So I think that there's a positive thing, but let's see what happens this week.
Right, in a few days from now.
A few days.
Thank you very much,
yeah.
Bhavani. I now move attention to Attorney at Law, Dr. Dihangu.
A very quick points just to sum up. I think there's a process that has been clearly set out in the law in terms of how the next president needs to be elected. And what's really important is that MPs understand that they're casting their vote not for themselves, but in the public interest. They hold those votes in trust for the public. And they have to understand that very, very unique role. And if the election is purely for political interest, we're going to get a leadership that lacks the legitimacy of the public, and we're going to continue to see protests in the country. Number two, I think this state of emergency is totally in bad faith, and it is really a maneuver to campaign in this election. And we need to really resist this state of emergency and call for it to be revoked as soon as possible. It does not, as I said before, it does not add any value in terms of actual protection of the public from violence. It doesn't have a public security benefit. So I think that state of emergency has to also go. And finally, whoever who takes on this very, very unenviable task of leading the country through this crisis, ultimately that person, the leadership, his team or her team, ultimately needs to be a team that can prioritize the public interest and not preoccupied by their political insecurity. I think without that element, we're not going to see the country come out of a crisis anytime soon.
Well, thank you very much, Attorney at Law, Dr. Gihan. Thank you very much, Attorney at Law Bhavani Fonseca, Senior Researcher, Center for Policy Alternatives, for joining us this evening on the show. Mr. Raziq Zarruq, President's Counsel, for joining us on the show tonight, as well as Attorney at Law Dr. Gihan Tilaka for joining us on Face the Nation tonight. Thank you very much, Shalan, and thank you very much, Jayama, for joining us this evening on Face the Nation as well. I leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do. The Constitution is not a document to restrain the people. Instead, it is an instrument for the people to restrain the government. Take care and goodbye.